The Galactic Ethics Academy on Nexus Prime had all the aesthetic charm of a crystalline cathedral crossed with a philosophical torture chamber. Its translucent walls hummed with the self-importance of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom, each surface etched with flowing script in 17 different languages, all presumably saying something profound about morality and the greater good. The irony, of course, was that most visitors spent more time admiring the architecture than contemplating the ethics. But then again, that was rather the point. Professor Zandari Vothka floated at the front of Lecture Hall 7, his ethereal form shimmering with that particular shade of smugness that only comes from centuries of academic tenure. The ethereals had perfected the art of looking wise while saying absolutely nothing of substance, and Vothka was a master practitioner. His 6 crystalline eyes swept over the assembled students with the casual disdain of someone who had never questioned whether his own species might occasionally be wrong about, well, anything. The classroom itself was a testament to galactic diversity, assuming one's definition of diversity included only the species wealthy enough to afford academy tuition. Tentacled cephalopods from the spiral arm clustered in specialized moisture pods, their chromatophores flickering with scholarly excitement. A pair of hive minds sat perfectly still, probably having entire philosophical debates in their shared consciousness while appearing to nap. The rock-like basalt delegates had claimed the back corner, where their natural tendency to sleep through lectures would cause the least disruption. And then there was the human. She sat in the middle section, unremarkable by galactic standards. No exotic tentacles, no crystalline projections, no ability to photosynthesize or communicate through interpretive dance, just 2 arms, 2 legs, and an unsettling tendency to take actual notes instead of simply recording everything for later digital absorption. The other students had initially found her primitive writing implements amusing, actual ink on actual paper, like some sort of Stone Age throwback. Now, 3 weeks into the semester, they had grown used to the soft scratching sound of her pen, the way she occasionally paused to think before writing, as if words actually mattered. Vothka cleared his crystalline throat, a sound like wind chimes having an existential crisis. Today, we examine the theoretical frameworks underlying just warfare, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. We shall, of course, begin with an analysis of primitive approaches to conflict resolution, most notably those employed by certain younger species who have yet to evolve beyond their barbaric tendencies. The human's pen stopped moving. The species in question, Vothka continued, warming to his topic like a politician approaching a convenient scapegoat, demonstrates a troubling attachment to what they term total war, a concept so philosophically bankrupt that it barely merits academic discussion. Where civilized species understand the importance of proportional response, measured engagement, and the preservation of cultural artifacts, these primitives simply destroy. A cephalopod's tentacles rippled with what might have been amusement or disgust with their species. The distinction was largely academic. One of the hive minds made a soft humming sound, their version of thoughtful agreement. The basalt delegates continued their geological impression of actual rocks. The human raised her hand. Vothka's shimmer dimmed slightly, the ethereal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. In 3 decades of teaching, he had grown accustomed to students who either worshipped his every word, or slept through them entirely. Active participation was unusual. Yes, ma'am. He paused, consulting his roster with the theatrical reluctance of someone being asked to pronounce a particularly unpleasant medical condition. Halifax, the human supplied helpfully. I was wondering about your definition of total. Are we discussing the theoretical concept, or specific historical examples? Theoretical, naturally, Vothka replied, his tone suggesting that anyone requiring specific examples was clearly intellectually deficient. We are, after all, engaged in philosophical discourse, not historical documentation. Halifax nodded slowly, making another note on her primitive paper. Of course, though I imagine the theoretical framework becomes more interesting when applied to actual conflicts. For context, the professor's shimmer brightened, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate superior knowledge. Indeed, the younger species we're examining has engaged in numerous conflicts that demonstrate their fundamental misunderstanding of civilized warfare. They show no appreciation for the elegant restraint that characterizes proper military engagement. Elegant restraint, Halifax repeated, writing carefully. That's a fascinating phrase. Could you elaborate on what constitutes elegant restraint in galactic warfare? Vothka practically glowed with pedagogical pleasure. Nothing delighted an academic quite like a chance to explain why their particular civilization was morally superior to everyone else's. Certainly, civilized species understand that warfare serves specific political and social functions. When the ethereal confederacy engaged in our expansion campaigns, for instance, we took great care to preserve the essential cultural elements of incorporated species, their art, their literature, their basic social structures, all maintained intact. Incorporated, Halifax said, not quite making it a question. A much more precise term than the crude concept of conquest favored by primitive species, Vothkai explained, his tone taking on the patient condescension reserved for particularly slow students. We provided guidance, structure and access to advanced civilization. In return, these species contributed their unique perspectives to our greater cultural tapestry. The scratching of Halifax's pen seemed unusually loud in the crystalline chamber. Several students shifted in their specialized seating arrangements, though whether from discomfort or simple boredom was difficult to determine. How generous, Halifax murmured, still writing. Vothka's luminescence intensified, interpreting Halifax's response as genuine appreciation rather than the verbal equivalent of a loaded weapon. The professor had spent enough time in academic echo chambers to mistake polite interest for intellectual validation, a mistake that would prove considerably more expensive than his usual errors in grading. Indeed, our approach demonstrates the evolution of warfare from crude destruction to sophisticated integration, he continued, gesturing toward a holographic display that materialized above the lecture podium. Consider, for instance, the honorable conquest of the verdant system. When we encountered the plant-based chlorophyll collective, we could have simply eliminated them as biological competitors. Instead, we recognized their unique photosynthetic capabilities and incorporated them into our agricultural sectors. The hologram showed green tree-like beings tending vast gardens under the watchful supervision of floating ethereal overseers. It was all very pastoral and inspiring, assuming one didn't think too hard about the semantics of forced agricultural labor, or wonder why all the gardens happened to be shaped like detention facilities. Halifax's pen continued its steady scratching. What happened to their original political structures? Obsolete, Vothka replied with a dismissive wave. Why maintain primitive governmental systems when superior guidance was available? The collective's Council of Roots democracy was charming in its simplicity, but hardly efficient for modern galactic integration. So you dissolved their government, Halifax said, still not quite making it a question. We evolved their governance, the professor corrected, his tone suggesting that Halifax's grasp of political nuance was somewhat lacking. The distinction is crucial for understanding civilized conflict resolution. One of the cephalopods shifted in its moisture pod, tentacles curling with what experienced observers might recognize as discomfort. The chlorophyll collective had been their trading partners for several centuries before the ethereal evolution had made such partnerships awkward to maintain. Vothka, oblivious to the growing tension, expanded his holographic display to include 2 additional star systems. Similarly, our engagement with the crystal singers of Harmony 7 demonstrated remarkable restraint. These crystalline beings possessed extraordinary acoustic abilities, their entire culture centered around sonic frequencies that could reshape matter at the molecular level. Rather than viewing this as a threat, we saw opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Halifax asked, though her tone suggested she might already know the answer. Industrial application, naturally. Their abilities were perfectly suited for large-scale construction projects. We established training centers where they could refine their talents while contributing to galactic infrastructure development. The humans stopped writing entirely, looking up at the professor, with an expression that several students would later describe as politely interested, and which Professor Vothka would retrospectively recognize as the calm before a particularly devastating storm. Training centers, Halifax repeated slowly. Were these volunteers? Vothka's shimmer flickered, barely perceptible but enough to suggest that this particular question had touched on something he'd rather not examine too closely. The concept of voluntary participation is somewhat complex when dealing with species that lack sophisticated understanding of galactic aeonics and social structures. We provided guidance and structure that enabled them to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. Halifax made another note. And what happened to their traditional harmonic compositions, their cultural music, preserved in our archives, Vothka said quickly. We maintain extensive cultural preservation databases. Archived. While the composers themselves were working in training centers. The professor's defensive instincts finally activated, several centuries too late. Miss Halifax, I sense a certain tone in your questioning that suggests unfamiliarity with the complexities of interspecies integration. These decisions were made by committees of experts, after extensive ethical deliberation. Halifax nodded thoughtfully. Of course, and the Twilight Sovereignty. That was also an extensively deliberated decision. The lecture hall went very, very quiet. Even the basalt delegates seemed to stir slightly, their rocky forms shifting with the geological equivalent of sudden attention. The Twilight Sovereignty wasn't exactly classified information, but it also wasn't the sort of topic that appeared in standard ethics curricula. Vothka's shimmer dimmed to something approaching transparency. The Twilight Sovereignty presented a unique challenge that required decisive action. Their expansionist tendencies threatened galactic stability. Expansionist, Halifax mused, consulting her notes. That's interesting terminology. According to the Nexus Historical Archive, they were defending their home system against resource extraction operations. Section 47B of the Galactic Historical Record indicates they never actually left their solar system. The silence in the lecture hall had evolved from quiet to actively oppressive. Several students were now staring at Halifax with expressions ranging from fascination to horror, as if watching someone casually dismantle a nuclear device while discussing the weather. Archive records can be misleading without proper contextual understanding, Vothka said, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to maintain professorial authority while standing in intellectual quicksand. Oh, absolutely, Halifax agreed cheerfully. Context is everything. For instance, the context that the sovereignty's expansionist tendencies consisted entirely of refusing to relocate when the ethereal mining consortium needed their star for fuel extraction. Very aggressive of them to continue existing in their own solar system. The professor's shimmer was now approaching the optical density of morning mist. Miss Halifax, these are complex political situations that cannot be reduced to simple narratives of aggression and victimization. You're absolutely right, Halifax said, making another note. Which brings us back to your original point about primitive human warfare. I'm curious about this distinction between civilized and barbaric approaches to conflict. Could you clarify the ethical framework that makes displacing species for resource extraction more civilized than, say, defending one's home planet? Vothka opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, then opened it again, achieving a remarkable resemblance to a fish experiencing an existential crisis. The holographic displays flickered as his concentration wavered, causing the pastoral garden scenes to flicker between their sanitized presentation version and what might have been considerably less pastoral reality. The situations are not comparable, he finally managed. Human conflicts demonstrate wanton destruction, without purpose or restraint. Halifax tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey the intellectual equivalent of loading a particularly large cannon. Without purpose, that's fascinating. I wasn't aware the Academy had access to classified Human Defense Force strategic documents. Most of our military planning remains under diplomatic seal. The scratching of her pen resumed, steady and implacable as entropy itself. The moment stretched like a rubber band approaching its breaking point, filled with the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophic violence. Professor Vothka hovered at his podium, his ethereal form flickering between various degrees of transparency, as his confidence underwent rapid structural failure. The holographic displays continued their erratic dance, occasionally revealing glimpses of reality that the Academy's sanitized curriculum had spent considerable effort to obscure. Halifax set down her pen with deliberate precision, the small click echoing through the crystalline chamber like a judge's gavel. When she stood, the movement was unhurried, almost casual, but somehow it commanded absolute attention from every being in the room. Even the basalt delegates had abandoned their geological impression of furniture, their rocky forms leaning forward with the kind of focused interest typically reserved for impending natural disaster. Professor, Halifax said, her voice carrying the deceptively calm tone of someone about to deliver news that would fundamentally restructure the recipient's understanding of reality. I appreciate your detailed explanation of civilized warfare theory. It's been quite educational. However, I find myself curious about one small detail. Vothka's shimmer stabilized slightly, perhaps interpreting her measured tone as a return to acceptable academic discourse. The poor deluded creature had apparently mistaken the eye of the storm for clear sky. When you speak of just wars, Halifax continued, clasping her hands behind her back in a gesture that would have seemed professorial if not for the way it made every other student in the room suddenly aware of their own mortality. Do you mean yours, or the one we buried? The question landed in the lecture hall like a tactical nuclear device, wrapped in polite academic inquiry. The silence that followed was so complete that the building's atmospheric recycling systems seemed to pause in respect for the moment. Vothka's ethereal form flickered through several colors that didn't exist in most species' visible spectrum, finally settling on a shade that could best be described as existential confusion, mixed with dawning horror. I'm afraid I don't understand your reference, the professor managed, though his voice had acquired the brittle quality of someone who understood perfectly and desperately wished he didn't. Halifax smiled, and several students would later describe that expression as the most terrifying thing they had ever witnessed, primarily because it was so genuinely pleasant. Oh, I think you do. You see, Professor, while you were discussing the elegant restraint of ethereal conflict resolution, I couldn't help but think about a small planet in the Outer Rim territories, designation KX7429. Perhaps you know it better by its former name, Haven. The professor's form began to oscillate between dimensions, a sure sign of extreme ethereal distress. That designation doesn't appear in our current star charts. No, Halifax agreed cheerfully. It would. Haven was officially redesignated as Mining Sector 7429, after the Ethereal Confederacy's civilized integration process concluded. Though I suppose concluded is a rather optimistic term for what actually happened. She began to pace slowly, her footsteps creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the professor's increasingly erratic shimmer. The other students watched with the fascination of observers at a traffic accident, unable to look away despite growing certainty that they were witnessing something that would require extensive therapy to process properly. Haven was home to approximately 4 million beings, Halifax continued conversationally. The refuge species, lovely people, actually. They had this charming custom of building their cities in harmony with local ecosystems. Very sustainable, very peaceful. Their biggest weapons were agricultural implements, and their most advanced military strategy involved strongly worded diplomatic protests. Vothka made a sound like crystal chimes being strangled. Miss Halifax, I fail to see the relevance of this particular. The relevance, Halifax interrupted with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested interrupting her again would be inadvisable, is that Heaven contained the largest known deposits of quantum-stabilized chromium in the galaxy, essential for faster-than-light travel. As I'm sure you know, the Ethereal Confederacy made several generous offers to establish mining operations on the planet. Generous offers that were unfortunately rejected due to the primitive species' failure to understand the greater galactic good. Vothka said, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone reciting a script he no longer believed. Halifax nodded thoughtfully. Yes, they were quite unreasonable about it. Apparently they had some silly objection to the fact that extracting the chromium would require strip mining their entire planet, and relocating all 4 million inhabitants to nowhere in particular, since no suitable relocation sites were ever actually identified. The cephalopods in their moisture pods had begun changing colors rapidly, cycling through the full spectrum of distress. One of the hive minds was making a low humming sound that suggested their shared consciousness was having a heated internal debate about whether to flee or demand details. When diplomatic solutions proved impossible, Halifax continued, the Confederacy was forced to take decisive action to prevent a dangerous precedent. After all, if one species could simply refuse galactic development projects, where would it end? The situation required careful management, Vothka whispered, his form now barely visible. Oh, it was managed very carefully indeed, Halifax said, her tone brightening as if discussing a particularly successful dinner party. The Ethereal Defense Force arrived with a full battle fleet. Very impressive display of civilized warfare in action. They gave the inhabitants exactly 72 standard hours to evacuate their planet. That was generous by any measure,
the professor protested weakly. Absolutely generous, Halifax agreed. 72 hours to pack up 4 million lives and find somewhere else in the galaxy to exist. The fact that no transportation was provided, no destination suggested, and no resources allocated for the evacuation was simply an oversight. She stopped pacing and turned to face Vothka directly. But here's the truly elegant part of the whole civilized approach. When it became clear that evacuating 4 million beings in 72 hours without ships, supplies or destination was logistically impossible, the Defense Force demonstrated remarkable ethical flexibility. The professor had become so transparent, he was essentially a shimmer of guilty conscience, with delusions of academic authority. They extended the deadline, Halifax said, her smile widening, all the way to 73 hours. And when that proved equally impossible, they made the difficult but necessary decision to proceed with the mining operation while the inhabitants were still on planet. After all, the greater galactic good couldn't wait for the logistical difficulties of a primitive species. The casualties were regrettable, but unavoidable, Vothka managed. Halifax's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, and suddenly every student in the room understood with crystal clarity that they were no longer listening to a polite academic discussion. They were witnessing an execution. Casualties, Halifax repeated softly. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe the systematic orbital bombardment of population centers. Very clinical terminology. The Defense Force reports called it terrain preparation for optimal extraction efficiency. 4 million beings became terrain preparation. The lecture hall had achieved a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Even the building's atmospheric systems had given up any pretense of normal operation. But you know what the truly beautiful part was? Halifax asked, her voice carrying the kind of gentle curiosity that preceded the delivery of absolutely devastating truth. The ethereal confederacy was so committed to civilized warfare that they made sure to preserve samples of refuge culture in their archive. Art, music, literature, all carefully catalogued and stored for posterity. She paused, letting the implication settle like radioactive dust. While the artists, musicians and writers were being vaporized by the mining laser, the words hung in the crystalline air like a toxic cloud, poisoning every rationalization and ethical framework that had been carefully constructed over centuries of academic discourse. Professor Vothka's form had achieved such transparency that he was essentially a guilty conscience, with tenure, flickering between dimensions as if trying to escape into a reality where Halifax's words weren't systematically demolishing his entire worldview. Halifax walked back to her desk with the unhurried confidence of someone who had just delivered a masterclass in applied truth-telling. She sat down, picked up her pen, and resumed taking notes as if she hadn't just detonated the academic equivalent of a thermonuclear device in the middle of Galactic civilization's most prestigious ethics program. Now then, she said, conversationally, I believe we were discussing the theoretical frameworks underlying just warfare, specifically the distinction between civilized and primitive approaches to conflict resolution. The other students remained frozen in various states of shock and existential crisis. The cephalopods had cycled through their entire emotional spectrum and started over, their chromatophores now displaying colors that probably didn't have names in any known language. The hive minds had gone completely silent, their shared consciousness apparently occupied with the kind of intensive damage assessment usually reserved for natural disaster. Even the basalt delegates had abandoned their impression of geological formations, their rocky features arranged in expressions of what could generously be called profound discomfort. Vothka made a sound like wind chimes being processed through a garbage disposal. Miss Halifax, he whispered, these are complex situations that cannot be understood through such simplistic analysis. Halifax looked up from her notes with the kind of polite attention usually reserved for particularly slow children attempting to explain advanced mathematics. Oh, absolutely. Complexity is crucial to understanding. For instance, it's quite complex to maintain the illusion of moral superiority while systematically exterminating species for their natural resources. That requires remarkable psychological flexibility. We are not exterminators, the professor protested, his form solidifying slightly as indignation temporarily overcame shame. Of course not, Halifax agreed readily. Exterminators typically show their work. They don't bury the evidence under mining platforms and call it galactic development. Speaking of which, I'm curious about the burial practices your species employed on Haven. Was there any attempt to preserve the remains of the refuge population, or did the mining lasers handle both terrain preparation and body disposal simultaneously? The question landed with the precision of a surgical instrument applied to an infected wound. Vothka's shimmer collapsed entirely, leaving him looking remarkably like a jellyfish having an identity crisis. The mining process, comprehensive, he admitted, the words emerging like a confession extracted under torture. Halifax nodded thoughtfully. Comprehensive, another elegant euphemism. So when I asked whether you meant your just wars or the one we buried, the answer is that there wasn't really anything left to bury, was there? Very efficient, very civilized. She stood again, and this time every student in the room instinctively leaned back, as if proximity to Halifax had become hazardous to their psychological health. You see, Professor, this is where human warfare becomes interesting, Halifax continued, beginning another leisurely pace around the lecture hall. We have a rather primitive approach to conflict documentation. When we kill people, we tend to admit it. When we destroy civilizations, we write it down in our history books. When we commit atrocities, we build monuments to remember them and teach our children not to repeat them. Barbaric, Vothka whispered, though the word carried no conviction. Absolutely barbaric, Halifax agreed cheerfully. We have this terrible habit of acknowledging our failures and trying to learn from them. Very unsophisticated, much more elegant to sanitize the historical record and teach courses on ethical warfare while the mass graves are still settling. One of the cephalopods finally found its voice, a bubbling sound that emerged from its moisture pod like a question wrapped in existential dread. The humans, they document their own atrocity. Halifax turned toward the pod with a smile that managed to be both gentle and absolutely terrifying. Oh yes, we have extensive records of every genocide, every war crime, every moment when we failed to live up to our own stated principle. We teach them in our schools, debate them in our legislatures, and build memorials to remember the victims. It's quite primitive really. We actually expect our leaders to take responsibility for their actions. The silence that followed was the kind typically associated with the heat death of the universe, or the moment when an entire civilization realizes it has been lying to itself for millennia. But here's the truly barbaric part, Halifax continued, returning to her desk and making another note on her primitive paper. When we encounter other species, we don't assume they're inferior just because they use different technologies or social structure. We don't redefine conquest as integration or genocide as development. We call things by their actual names, even when those names are uncomfortable. Vothka had achieved a level of transparency that suggested he was one ethical revelation away from ceasing to exist entirely. What are you? He managed. Halifax looked up from her notes with an expression of mild surprise. I'm a student, Professor, though I suppose I should clarify, I'm not exactly an exchange student. I'm Dr. Halifax, from the Human Institute for Galactic Historical Documentation. I specialize in comparative warfare analysis and the archaeological excavation of mass graves. The last sentence hit the lecture hall like a meteorite strike. Several students made sounds that their respective species probably didn't have words for, expressing the kind of shock typically reserved for discovering that one's entire reality was constructed from lies and wishful thinking.